Hello, thanks for joining me. On a back road between Blaenporth and Llangoedmor in Ceredigion, I came upon this isolated little wayside chapel with its tiny cemetery. Blaenwenen Baptist Chapel was founded in 1838. The nearest place for Baptists to worship was some distance away, so it served the scattered farms and small settlements in the parishes of Blaenporth, Llangoedmor and Llangoedmor. The original cemetery is tiny. There's a newer extension on the other side of the far wall. It contains only a few monuments dating over about 65 years. But there are some interesting stories associated with the people here. They were generally of modest means, labourers, clogmakers, dressmakers, sailors and the like. But their lives were typical of those who lived in this part of Wales in the 19th century. John Griffiths was the first to be buried here. He died 2 years after the chapel was opened, aged 87. This place owes everything to him, as he paid for the chapel to be built. And he liked it here so much he built himself a house next door, also called Blaenwenen, and farmed here. His son David was a deacon of the chapel and is buried here with his wife Mary. Blaenwenen continued to be farmed by the same family. William Griffiths and his wife Jane had 9 children, 3 of whom are remembered on the monument here. John, their third son, died in Melbourne, Australia in 1854 when he was only 19. Whether he was a sailor or had gone to make his fortune in the gold rush, I don't know, but his father, having no hope of visiting his grave, erected this stone to his memory, and then added his youngest son Benjamin's name to it, also dead at 19, and then the name of Thomas, their 4th son, who died aged 29. Jane Griffiths died in 1852, aged 45. Her husband William died in 1877, aged 70. Jacob, their second son, had left Blaenwenen Farm to farm at Munt and then at Pantgwyn. But his wife Rachel died aged 36, leaving 8 children, the oldest 14, the youngest only 1. 2 of her children are remembered here on their mother's stone. John, who died 12 years before her, aged only 3 months, and William, her third son, who died after her in 1884, aged 23, on a voyage between Swansea and New York. Perhaps he was emigrating. Many did. Life was hard here, and the prospect of more land and more money was tempting for many. Another family who was central to life at the chapel were the Miles family of Blaenpant Mill in Llangoedmor. Nathaniel Miles was the minister here and at Cilfawr near Llangoedmor. His epitaph is somewhat challenging to read, as the stonecutter decided not to bother with spaces between the words. It tells us that he was minister here for 38 years and died in 1865, aged 90. His wife Esther was 25 years his junior. She died in 1879, aged 84. They were both long-lived, but Esther's aunt, Esther Nathan, lived longer. She died in 1871, aged 103. Nathaniel Miles had a small farm of 9 acres and a mill. His second son, James, became the miller and stayed with his parents after his brothers and sisters had left. After his father's death when he was 38, he helped his mother farm and took on a young farm servant called Catherine Isaac, who was 22 and from Cilgerran. He married her and they had a daughter, Esther, named after her grandmother. James died in 1905, aged 73, and Catherine, or Kitty as she was known, and Esther continued farming, taking in an English gamekeeper as a lodger. Kitty died in 1912, aged 65, and Esther, the loyal daughter, never married. Robert Stevens was born in Ceredigion and then was a farm servant in Kenarth parish. After that, he and his wife Sarah went to the Rhondda, where Robert worked as a collier for a while, and then they came back to West Wales, and he worked as an undergardener in Llangoedmor. Then in 1891 he was back in the Rhondda, leaving his family behind whilst he worked hard down the pit to earn money to keep them. The Stephens had lost Elizabeth, their daughter, in 1886, aged only 1 month, but in 1892 they lost 2 more. In March, Sophia, aged 17, died, and in April, Tommy, aged 10, died. Of their 6 children, only 3 remained. The following year, Sarah died, aged 43. Robert remarried and settled in Llangoedmor with Maud, his new wife, and had 4 more children. When he died, he was buried here with his first wife. Abraham Elias was born in Aberporth, but lived most of his life in Llangoedmor parish. He was a clog maker. His wife Mary had 3 children. The youngest, David, was buried here in 1874, aged only 20, next to his parents, who died in the 1880s, aged 84 and 78. David and Esther Edwards died in the 1870s, both aged 82. David was an agricultural labourer, working almost to his death. Their only daughter, Margaret, lived with them in their later years, and, as many a devoted daughter in this role, she never married. She died in 1915, aged 81. Daniel Thomas was a waggoner on a farm in Llangoedmor. He was the last to be buried in the old cemetery, dying in 1917, aged 46. The new cemetery had actually opened a few years earlier. David Jones of Tanafron, near Llecryd, died in 1858, aged only 29. His wife Elizabeth died 10 years later, aged 37, having lost her daughter Phoebe in the same year as her husband, and her son John 10 and daughter Mary Ann 12 in 1863. James Jones of Henbant in Llangoedmor was a deacon, secretary and presenter of singing here when Nathaniel Miles was minister, and like that minister lived a very long life, dying in 1907, aged 91. He was an agricultural labourer and later employed as a gardener, often entering his produce in the local agricultural society shows. His wife Sarah is remembered as a kind, loving and tender mother. She died long before her husband. The inscription gives us the date 1857 and her age 36, but she appears in the 1861 census as still alive. Odd, perhaps family memory was wrong there. It tells us she left father and 3 young boys to mourn their loss, and also remembers their baby girl Anne, with no age or date given. One of his sons was a talented singer, performing as part of a quartet at a London wedding, reported proudly in the local newspaper. Alexander and Sarah Evans had a few acres of land and 3 daughters, Margaret, Eleanor and Mary, until 1842. In August of that year, Eleanor, 13, died, and in September her sister Mary followed her to the grave. In 1870, Sarah died, aged 74. In 1875, Alexander died, aged 75. John Davis lived near the chapel at Blaenwenen with his wife Mary, and he was an agricultural labourer. He died in 1893, aged 55. Mary, his wife, died in 1905, aged 72. They had several children, including 3 remembered on this stone. Maria died aged only 5 in 1874. Their son David went to sea. He died and was buried in Brazil in 1886, aged 20. James, another son, and Gwenllian, his wife, are also commemorated here, though the mason seems to have made a mistake with James's name and done a rather ugly correction, screwing on a bit of slate to cover the error. The Morris family had the Neuadd Cross Inn in Pantgwyn, a nearby hamlet. Benjamin was a coachman. He had lived, as servants often did, in many different places, with many different masters, once being coachman to General Sir James William Howard Fitzmayer. The Morris family settled at Neuath Cross. Margaret, Benjamin's wife, ran it as a public house. Her son John William was a general stonemason, and their daughter Mary a milliner. Benjamin died in 1901, aged 66. His son John William, the mason, died in 1905, aged 28, and his wife Margaret in 1907, aged 65. Evan Morris, no relation, and Mary Anna, his wife, ran the post office and shop at Pantgwyn. Evan sold groceries, and Mary Anna was the postmistress. They had 3 children in 1901, having lost Lily and Olwen in infancy. In August 1904, tragedy struck. On the 16th, their 4-year-old son, Rhys Owen Morris, died, and on the 30th of that month, Evan died aged 30, leaving Mary Anna with 1 young daughter, Maggie, and a young son, Benjamin. She died in the 1920s, aged 48. In 1901, this poem appeared in the Welsh newspaper Ceredigion, titled Llangoedmor Blaenwenen, or The Little Old Cemetery of Blaenwenen. Its author uses a bardic name, so I don't know who they were. I've done a very rough translation, my Welsh is not what it should be, which I'll read now, illustrated with some images of this atmospheric place. The Little Old Cemetery of Blaenwenen. The little old cemetery of Blaenwenen, inside your walls, I don't know if it was crying that filled my heart, and the memories of bygone days when we sang there sadly beside my grandmother's grave. Little old cemetery, how lonely you are, so peaceful, nothing but fresh grass on top of the graves, and a rough brown stone, and all the letters on it almost blasted by the corrupt rust of the world. The ivy has climbed the walls of the little chapel. Everything grows wild in the singing raw air, and a few monuments above the places of peace, like benevolent guardians, all watching the coffers of the grave. Little old cemetery of Blaenwenen, far from the crowds of town, here are the remains of some of the inhabitants of heaven. Yes, many tears rolling down cheeks wet the dust of this earth and testified to an angel in the soil. Little old cemetery, how hard it was to leave when I felt the evening shadows coming on. Not the gravestone, no, it was not art that made the place so dear to me, but a simple grandmother. I hope you enjoyed exploring the little old cemetery of Blaenwenen with me. Please remember to click the like button, and as always, thank you for watching.